Everyone. So my name is William George. I'm a researcher for the Claros Cooperative. So I'm also going to be talking about voting systems today, but from like a completely different angle. So I'm going to specifically talk about sort of how different election systems work in combination with Schelling games. So as I'm going to explain in a bit, Claros is a blockchain-based dispute resolution system that uses something called a Schelling game. And how sort of like the classical theory of how like vote aggregation like works in a Schelling game context. Okay, so describing sort of like how election theory, voting system theory works for us, I'll briefly recall how it sort of works classically. And the simplest voting system, the one you're probably all the most familiar with, is something called first past the post, or the plurality voting system. And this is the simplest voting system where you just have every person pick one candidate they want to vote for, and then once everyone's voted, you look at which candidate got the most votes, and they win. Even if they don't have a majority because there are more than two candidates and they only have a plurality, they win anyway. So this voting system can be problematic for a variety of reasons that have to do with tactical voting and vote splitting and strategic voting. So this political cartoon sort of illustrates this. If you're not familiar with this, in the 1912 US presidential election, a former Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt, ran against an incumbent, ran as an independent, against an incumbent Republican president, Taft, and the result was that a Democrat got elected. So, you know, these are the kinds of like pathological things that can happen when you have plurality voting with more than two candidates. Yeah, exactly, Woodrow Wilson. Okay, so a standard solution to this problem is to ask voters for more information. Instead of just picking one candidate. Instead, maybe I'll ask them to rank their candidates. So here, my hypothetical voter has ranked the pink angel first, the yellow angel second, and then sort of down the line. There are some other non-ranked ballot voting systems that social choice theorists have explored, approval voting, jugement majoritaire. I'm not going to go into those, but they also have this property that the voters are providing more information. And then what can I do with that information? Well, there are a whole bunch of different ways that I can aggregate that into an election winner. So one standard classical process is that I'll assign points based on where I rank the candidates. The person that I rank first will get maybe 3 points. The person I rank second will maybe get 2 points, and down the line. This is called the border system. Another example, another system that people use is called instant runoff. So here I've ranked the candidates again, and now what happens is after everyone's voted, I wait, and then I check how many first place votes each candidate gets. And whoever gets the least first place votes, they're eliminated. They're gone. So here, imagine I put the pink angel first, and my pink angel, he came in last. He's gone. He's eliminated, but then there's like another round. I don't vote again, but they reattribute the vote that I already made to whoever I ranked second. So now my vote just sort of flows to the yellow angel. And you keep going like this until someone gets a majority. And it's called instant runoff because you simulate a series of runoffs where there is one fewer rounds in the number of candidates. This system is used for parliamentary elections in Australia, for example. It's also used for the Academy Awards. However, there is a somewhat like a problem with this. And there's this famous theorem of Arrow, Kenneth Arrow, that all voting systems that are based on ranked choice voting have some tactical voting. There are some situations in which I would be incentivized to put a ranking of candidates that is not what I actually want, not what I actually believe, in order to try to game the system so that a candidate I prefer will do better than if I'd voted honestly. So that's kind of sad, but you know, that's the mathematical reality. And so as an example for how like a situation like this in instant runoff, these are the results from the Burlington, Vermont in the US mayoral election in 2009. So there was a Democrat, among the major candidates, a Democrat, a Republican, and this progressive candidate who was kind of to the left of the Democrat. And then if you look carefully at the results, you'll notice that if a bunch of Republicans had ranked the Democrat first, then the ultimate runoff between the last two candidates standing would have been between the Democrat and the progressive, and the Democrat would have won. But instead, because the Republican was in the last round against the progressive, then the Republican lost to the progressive. And these Republican voters, based on their votes they made, you can see that they preferred the Democrat to the progressive, so if they had voted differently, they would have gotten the Democrats to the progressive, and they would have preferred that, so this is an example of tactical voting in instant runoff. So this applies to all ranked choice voting systems according to Arrow. And since Arrow's theorem, social choice theorists, the scholars who study this, have basically looked at the different kinds of properties hope a voting system could have, the kinds of partial resistance to strategic voting, and they looked at different voting systems, and you basically have this like table of trade-offs, where it's like some voting systems have some properties, and other voting systems have some other properties, and not every voting system, no voting system can have all of them, but you kind of pick the ones you need based on your use case. And a few examples of those kinds of properties that are considered. There's a property called monotonicity, which is the idea that if I vote some way and candidate A wins, and I vote some other way where I move candidate A up, candidate A should still win. So that's and there's a similar property for moving somebody down, not causing them to win. So that's voting systems like that are called monotonic. Not every voting system is monotonic. That's one of the good properties you might want to have. Another property is clone independence or clone resistance. So there's a formal definition of this, but roughly it says that if I have some similar candidates, they don't split the vote. The fact that I have 3 angels here does not make the devil more likely to win than if I just had 1 angel. The devil is not more or less likely to win than if I had just a single copy of the clone. Okay, so what does this all have to do with blockchains and cryptocurrency and Claros? I'm going to change gears a bit and explain to you exactly something called a Schelling point and how Schelling point voting can work. So a Schelling point is a concept that was introduced by Thomas Schelling, who's an economist, who won the Nobel Prize, that when people are trying to coordinate but they can't communicate between each other, they'll sort of gravitate towards solutions that seem natural, special, or relevant to them. So the example that Schelling liked to give was that if 2 people are trying to meet each other in New York City, but they're trying to meet tomorrow, but they don't know where, and they don't know what time, the natural thing to do, the thing that empirically most people try to do, is go to Grand Central Station at noon. Okay? The information desk at Grand Central Station at noon. If they're meeting in Paris, maybe they would go stand under the Eiffel Tower. With the idea being that the Grand Central Station is just sort of a natural meeting place. People just like think of that as a place to meet, so if I don't know where else this other person might try to meet me, I'll go to Grand Central Station hoping they think, oh, it's kind of a meeting place, maybe the other person think, well, a meeting place too, even though there's nothing like intrinsically special about that place. Okay? And then, so in Claros, we're a dispute resolution system that's based on a blockchain, crowdsourced. And basically what we do is we take a bunch of crowdsourced, randomly selected participants, and we incentivize them to vote on disputes based on a Schelling point incentive system. So imagine I have a small business owner, Alice, that hires a freelancer, Bob, to build her a website. And she's not happy with the quality of his work. The money to payment for the escrow is put into escrow. For the website is put into escrow. And then eventually she's unhappy, so she's like, I want a dispute. In Claros, like a bunch of crowdsourced jurors are chosen, and then they are penalized if they are inconsistent with how the other jurors vote, and they're rewarded if they're consistent with how the other jurors vote. With the idea of the fundamental idea of Claros being that if I not communicating with the other jurors, and I analyze the case, and I think Alice is right, I'll expect the other jurors to also analyze the case and probably also think Alice is right. So I'm going to vote for Alice because I expect other people to also gravitate towards Alice because honesty is kind of a Schelling point in the absence of communication, etc. So, like this juror here in the middle is like, okay, I've analyzed the case, I think Alice is right. The other 2 jurors are probably also going to vote for Alice because they probably also think Alice is right. And then they all vote for Alice. Hopefully, statistically, more or less, this should work on average most of the time. But this voting system is fundamentally different than sort of the classical democratic elections I want my candidate to win voting system because my incentives are totally different. I no longer care about who wins. I don't have a dog in the fight between Alice and Bob. I'm not trying to get my candidate elected president anymore. However, basically I just want to optimize my own economic return by my coherence payment for being right, agreeing with the other jurors. But you find that a lot of the pathologies that exist in classical voting systems sort of manifest themselves here in maybe slightly different ways. So if I look at the plurality voting system again, well, maybe I have more than 2 choices. Maybe in addition to pay Bob and refund Alice, the other choices that are put to the jurors, in Claros these choices are sort of agreed on before there's a dispute at the beginning between Alice and Bob when they set up the contract. But the other choices that are put to the jurors, maybe they're choices to give Bob more time. Give Bob a chance to fix up the website and work out the kinks. So maybe there's a choice to give Bob 7 more days. And maybe there's a choice to give Bob 8 more days. Maybe there's a choice to give Bob 9 more days. And I might analyze the case and think, Bob just needs more time. He can work this out. But if I look at this, I might say to myself, oh, the odds of any one of these more time options winning is really low because they're going to split the vote between each other. And this is worse in this sort of Schelling point logic. This dishonest choice here of just refunding Alice, just refund Alice, is actually like distinguished now. It's a dishonest choice among the sea of honest choices. So I might gravitate towards that just because it stands out, expecting other people to gravitate towards that because it stands out. So like Schelling point voting needs to pay careful attention to these kinds of phenomena. In Claros, so far, all of our disputes have been sort of de facto binary, to the degree that I haven't been like literally binary. Usually the other choices beyond the top sort of 2 plausible choices are sort of like unlikely to happen, unlikely to be chosen edge cases. And then furthermore, plurality also sort of decreases your attack resistance. Imagine, now the vote is splitting in between the angels, and I'm trying to bribe the voters. Maybe I only need to bribe like a third of the voters in order to get the most votes compared to the angels. Whereas if there was only a binary choice, I'd have to bribe half of the people. I'd have to do sort of 51% attack, what we call a 51% attack. So 51% attack resistance is decreased by using plurality. Okay, so what can we do? And we've done research to study what kinds of voting systems and incentive systems can work in a multiple choice scenario in a Schelling point system. It's important to note that the voting system and the incentive system sort of go hand in hand. Before, when I was talking about the incentives, I was just like, oh, if you're coherent, you'll be rewarded. If you're incoherent, you'll be penalized. Well, what if there are like a bunch of choices? What does it mean to be coherent? If I put the final winner second, is that coherent enough? So I'll hit on what that means in a multiple choice scenario. And we want this to work even when they're non-binary choices. Okay, so our sort of candidate incentive system, so we're planning on using a slightly more complicated version of this, but this gets the idea across. Basically, like each voter will put in a deposit of little d, and if they are wrong, they lose a deposit that's given by this formula. So if I say that the ultimate winner is W, if I put the winner second, then I'll lose a little bit of my deposit, but not very much. If I put the winner third, I'll lose twice as much as if I put them second, fourth, 3 times as much, and so on. Do you have a question?
Can we have questions here? Do you give the options, or do the voters create the options?
The voters do not create the options. They're hard-coded. Like the parties to the disputes will create the options when they set up the contract that might eventually lead to a dispute. Okay.
What's the number of options?
Hmm?
So it's yes or no, yes? That at least can be ahead.
Well, so like my example with the we want Claros in the future to be able to handle like a wide variety of disputes that might have non-binary outcomes. So my sort of toy example from before was give Alice like the refund, pay Bob, give like more time in different amounts of time. So that's already a non-binary choice. You can come up with like insurance contracts where like different parties might need to pay, and it might not be like a binary thing. Okay. So, and then once that like Alice loses part, or like the voter loses parts of her deposit based on how coherent or not she is, that's redistributed using a very similar sort of set of formulas. Basically, the higher ranked I put the winning choice, the more of the like lost deposits from other people I get, and the more of the arbitration fees, which were sort of put in by the parties to pay for the dispute resolution process, that are sort of paid unequally to the jurors based on how coherent they were, the more of those I get. And then you can prove that under that incentive system, if you believe that the outcome is independent of your vote, which is a little strange, I'll hit on that in a second, then you're incentivized to just rank the choices by how likely they are. So I'm like, okay, I think the pink angel is the most likely to win, I'll rank him first. I think the yellow angel is second most likely, I'll rank him second. So this gives you like if I vote like this, the voters are providing like a useful signal of what honesty is. You would expect to be able to turn this information into a good set of outcomes if you have sort of a good voting system. Yeah?
How do you define honesty? Because what you just explained is that I don't vote as I want, I vote as others would vote.
Yes. So again, this sort of Schelling point principle that if you believe that the other people are going to honestly analyze the case, and the system's like incentivized to convince people to put in the effort and to analyze the case, then they... It's risk minimization. It's sort of a statistical property based on like I think people are going to gravitate towards this choice. So like honesty, like which should be the result of an honest evaluation most of the time. In most cases, particularly these sort of like low-hanging like freelancer disputes that are sort of semi-subjective but kind of partially objective. So if you want like this is a deep question. Like Federico is like like doing research on like the concept of what is fair and and dispute resolution, this kind of dispute resolution, and this like what is honesty is a very broad question. I don't really have time to go into that, and so.
Just to clarify, the honesty here doesn't mean that it's good, correct?
Like the idea of Claros is that like honesty in this framework should usually be good. Like maybe there'll be some edge cases where it's not, but it should be good most of the time to provide acceptable dispute resolution most of the time. But you know, it's not like an absolute thing.
There is no truth to be uncovered in this case.
No, because it's about like risk minimization and
Yeah. So I want to finish up one more time. So this idea that the outcome is independent of my vote, like that might mean strange, but if there are lots of voters, like maybe I'm just a little one, it's more or less independent of my vote. Also, Claros has an appeal system, so the outcome might literally be independent of my vote if there's an appeal, because then I'm looking at sort of the final outcome in a round that I'm not voting in. And then, so okay, like I have that incentive system. What kind of voting system can I use? Well, I want it to be clone independent for the reasons that I described before. I want, like, there's this notion of being, like, voting systems being a maximum likelihood estimator. This is like a branch of social choice theory that's been studied extensively in the context of, like, normal voting systems. And I don't really have time to go too much into this, but it's basically the idea of, like, the voting system translating the noisy information of the voters' honest votes into sort of a good collective outcome. I want the voting system to be easy to understand. The voters are trying to simulate how the voting system will, like, process other people's votes. I don't want voters to have to spend too much time thinking about the voting system itself. I want the voting system to be attack resistant. This is fundamental. In a blockchain world, anyone can spin up a smart contract and force attack, and you like need to be able to resist that. Usually that's like an economic resistance. It should cost more to attack than you get, ideally. And we talked about how plurality had low attack resistance because it like lowered the cost of 51% attacks. And then you have these kinds of trade-offs where you're like, oh, okay, well some properties are like clone independent, but like have less maximum likelihood estimator properties. Some have better or worse attack resistance. And you try to pick a voting system that sort of like is good enough based on your needs. And Claros in the medium term is we're planning to use instant runoff because it seems to meet a sort of like on average it works out to have good enough properties on most of these points. But already instant runoff, there's still voting pathologies here. So this is an example of a voting paradox in this situation where, like before I made this point about like I try to rank, I'm incentivized by the incentive system to rank my choices based on how likely they are to win. Assuming I think the vote is independent, the outcome is independent of my vote. If I drop this independent of my vote like assumption, like maybe it's the last round, maybe I think I have the key determining vote in a close election, then you get crazy stuff. So here I'm like, okay, I want to vote the first choice to be the most likely winner. But if I think the other voters are going to vote like this for some reason, then if I think, okay, A, I'm going to try to vote for A, then C becomes the most likely winner. Okay, I'll try to vote for C, then B becomes the most likely winner. Okay, I'll try to vote for B, then A becomes the most likely winner. So this, it's like weird sort of whack-a-mole voting paradox. And you basically construct this out of the kinds of voting paradoxes you have in instant runoff and sort of classical elections. You just sort of port them into this framework. And in fact, based on our research, we've seen that there's like a version of Arrow's theorem in this world. So for a precise statement of that sort of Schelling point-based Arrow's theorem and a proof of that, like maybe follow me on Twitter, that will come out relatively soon. But already you can kind of see how that might go with this example. So everything's about trade-offs and picking something that's sort of broadly acceptable and works most of the time, and minimizing the pathologies. So with that, I'm pretty much done. If I have any time for questions, I can take them. If not. Yep.
Can you explain what's mallory, this estimator?
Okay, so you want the maximum likelihood estimator thing? Okay, so this is the idea that if the voters submit noisy information, like say you believe that they're incentivized to be honest, they might still be wrong just based on like statistical variation. So they put in this like noisy vector of votes, but imagine there's a true vector that they see with noise. And then being a maximum likelihood estimator says that the voting system will output will output the most likely vote, like sort of in like a Bayesian framework based on the inputs that people put in. So your voting system isn't necessarily likely to like, there's this like, I have a true vote, I go to noise, I try to like aggregate based on the noise, and I hope to get the true vote back, and the maximum likely estimator says that you actually do, that you pick the most likely one.
So it means that consistent with this MLE.
Yep.
My question is about the scoring function. So let's say that there are 4 outcomes, and 2 of them, people are tend to one of them instead of the other, but for the other 2, people are kind of indifferent.
Mm-hmm.
So how does this behave in this situation? Because people will put the first one before the second, but this can appear in any place of the table, right?
Yep.
So that would mean that in the end, the first one would be on the top, right? Something like that.
Yeah, like a problem with sort of scoring function-based voting in the context of like the attack hostile world of blockchains, where did Borda go, is that people can, like they're burying attacks, where if I'm an attacker, I can bribe you not only to rank the attacker choice like first, but also to like bury its like closest rival last. And then you get into these sort of like, what do you expect people to, like ideally people would put all the honest choices at the top, and then maybe the scoring function would work kind of well, but does that get to the sense of your question, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's not perfect when you don't have any idea how to score a part of the option, right? So if you...
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. If you just look at this and you're like, okay, 1 and 2 are pretty close, and then these other ones, you know, like that also sort of increases the intellectual effort for the juror.
So that can give crazy results, right?
Yeah. I don't know if I have time for other questions. Does anyone have another question? Yeah.
Why not talking about the jugement majoritaire?
Yeah. So I mean, there are other sort of tactical voting systems, like tactical voting questions with approval voting and jugement majoritaire that basically come with what's my threshold for like, you know, in jugement majoritaire you put like, okay, this is excellent, this is good, this is not so great, and you rank that for each candidate. With approval voting, you're like, okay, I approve or I disapprove. And different people have different thresholds for whether something is like excellent or it's just sort of okay. And how you incentivize people to, like how you build the incentive system to incentivize people to provide honest answers that are like attack resistant. What do I do if like some attacker's trying to bribe me to say, don't put excellent, just put okay. Like how do you like pick out honest behavior? We would need a different incentive system, and there are different tactical voting questions that are involved. So this is something we've looked at, not quite as much as the ranked choice systems. That it's possible that a system could be built out of that. But in this context of trying to incentivize people to be honest and rewarding them in a Schelling way for being honest or dishonest, it does not seem as promising to us right now.
How do you stop collusion?
Yeah, so I mean that's a completely different question. Like one thing, so there are questions of like how do I, like if I have people communicating, how can I like incentivize them to communicate and collude? So the appeal structure is useful in that. I didn't get into quite how Claros works with respect to appeals, but you're incentivized to be honest with respect to an ultimate outcome. So if I'm colluding with the people in my voting round, and then ultimately the appeal picks something else because like, you know, I wasn't able to effectively coordinate with them, like me and all the colluders might lose because we picked the wrong side.
Just quickly though, how do they know in the voting, in the three judges, the voting pool, do they know the entities?
So in practice, for the moment, these people are basically Ethereum addresses.
It makes it harder. But then for the appeal, because in normal court cases, most things don't get appealed. So
Right.
it depends on,
Yeah.
it's up to that.
Yeah. So like how good a protection the appeal system is for sort of anti-collusion depends on how much you expect like wrong judgments to actually be appealed. So this is another segment of our research. You know, it's obviously relevant to this, but you know, there's like a rabbit hole there. Okay. So thanks everybody. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, you can just email me. I think I might have cards. But I'm William@claros.io. Yeah, so it depends on the sort of dispute that's being resolved. because resolving disputes requires effort. Like, if you were doing this like freelancer website thing, you have to spend time doing that. So there's an efficiency question that, like, if I ask too many